Now, what is this government deficit? When the expenditure exceeds the revenue. When expenditure exceeds the revenue, it is called government deficit. When the expenditure of the government exceeds the receipts of the government or the revenue of the government, we call it government deficit. So when the expenditure of the government exceeds the receipts, the revenue receipts of the government, we call it government deficit. Now under this government deficit, we have three types of government deficit: revenue deficit, then fiscal deficit, and primary deficit. So government deficit, which is excess of expenditure over the revenue or receipts of the government, is called government deficit. Now government deficit is of three types: revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, and primary deficit. Now revenue deficit refers to the excess of revenue expenditure over revenue receipts during the given fiscal year. Okay. Now this revenue deficit is excess of revenue expenditure over revenue receipts. Excess of revenue expenditure over revenue receipts during a given fiscal year. Excess of revenue expenditure over the revenue receipts means excess of expenditure over revenue is called in a fiscal year is called the revenue deficit. Now, what are the implications or what are the indications which the revenue deficit gives about the government? Okay, the first is it indicates the inability of the government to meet its regular expenditure. It indicates the inability of the government to meet its regular expenditure. It implies that the government is dissaving, means the government is not saving. Next, moreover, the government has to recover this deficit through capital receipts. The government has to recover this deficit through capital receipts. Moreover, a high revenue deficit is a signal that the government should curtail its expenditure. So it indicates that the government is insufficient to meet its expenditure. Okay. Next is the government is dissaving, that is, it is not saving. Next is to clear the deficit, to compensate the deficit, it has to encourage capital receipts. It is the only way. Next is it is a warning that the government should curtail its expenditure. Now, how can this revenue deficit be corrected? What are the steps that the government should take to correct this revenue deficit? So the government should stop the unproductive expenditures in the economy. The government should stop the unproductive expenditures in the economy. Next, the government should increase its revenue by various sources, that is tax and non-tax revenue. So the government should reduce or stop its unproductive expenditures in the economy. Moreover, it should increase its revenue through various receipts like tax and non-tax receipts. Okay. Next is fiscal deficit.